1 hour I make more. And so I just introduce and just discuss those comments.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed all these papers, and especially was happy to hear from our former Chicago PhD student, Professor Huang. I wanted to say a few things about just part of the last presentation, where you see a slide saying what happened on Jeju Island was a civil war between Koreans, and the U.S. had nothing to do with it. Now, this is almost always false. At any time in U.S. history with South and North Korea from 1945 onward, if they say something terrible happened, they say, well, we had nothing to do with it. It's usually false, and I'm going to show why it's false in this case. But the endless repetition of these claims of non-involvement creates a situation where the U.S. is the military occupant with all powers in Korea from 1945 to 48, but it's somehow an innocent bystander. Then there's a military coup in 1961. Some people say the Americans saw it coming, but the general line is, well, this is a Korean matter. And it goes on and on. When Chun Doo-hwan crushed the Gwangju Rebellion in 1980, the U.S. also denied any involvement, and then, of course, it turns out there was American involvement. But in the case of Jeju, it's impossible to argue that this was a civil war in which the U.S. had no role. Korean politics after the Japanese liberation is quite fascinating, and as many of you know, I did my first book on it. When the U.S. came in, they came in 3 weeks after the Russians. It took them a long time to get their military government and civil affairs teams set up. So you had a slow process of Americans taking up governing duties throughout southern Korea. They showed up in November in one place, not till December in another. In South Cholla province in the southwest, the U.S. essentially worked with the local governing organs that appeared all over Korea after the Japanese demise. They were called People's Committees, which makes it sound like a communist organization, but these organizations were actually quite complex, reflecting the local political balance of forces in the counties and towns where they appeared. In South Cholla, the U.S. military government essentially worked with the People's Committees for about a year. And if you read E. Grant Mead's book, I was happy to see his name up there, still a very good book on U.S. military government. He has a full account of the U.S. working with the People's Committee in South Cholla province. And then on Jeju Island, it essentially wasn't even working with the committee. The U.S. was standing there, doing nothing, letting the local people run the government until April of 1948, again with various people's committees around the island, but an indigenous government. And I think it compounds the tragedy of the massacres of Jeju Island when you realize that if the U.S. had just continued doing what it was doing, let Koreans govern their own affairs, stand by, with guns if necessary, to stop violence, but not intervene, then I think not only would South Korea have flourished, but probably unification with the North would have been much easier, and maybe we might have avoided war. But what the U.S. allowed, and it systematically directed the suppression of the Jeju rebellion after April 1948. Colonel Rothwell Brown, several other individuals named in Professor Wang's book and my work, several other Americans were engaged in daily direction of the suppression of the rebels. They seemed to have no concern for the extraordinary loss of life. They just wanted that rebellion put down, period. They also allowed to come into the island. It's very important to understand that transportation under the American occupation was controlled by the occupation. You didn't have Boeing 747s flying into Gimpo Airport. You had to get permission to fly into the airport. There was no Korean commercial service, or at least not much at all. And so the U.S. allowed the Northwest youth, a particularly virulent political group of fascists and terrorists. These aren't my terms. I looked at the internal documentation on this group for several years. These are American terms for the Sabuk, or Northwest youth, terrorists, fascists. They're from North Korea. They were kicked out. They suffered in North Korea, and they had a virulent anti-communist intent. And I really think they came into Jeju and saw the Jeju people as non-people, as people who, if they get in their way, just deserve to be killed. Henrik Guan, whom I mentioned earlier in the day, an anthropologist, he actually thinks there is a perception of racial difference between mainlanders and Jeju Islanders. And I don't, he knows much more about that than I do, but there certainly was a perception of difference with the othering of the people of Jeju. And so this Northwest Youth Group was allowed to be, to run wild. And somewhat like the movie Clockwork Orange, where the Drugis become the police, the Northwest Youth were taken into the local police on Jeju Island and were, by 1948 and 49, completely dominant in the island. And all of this happened while the U.S. had operational control of both the police and the military. This is very poorly understood, although people got it right this morning. The Republic of Korea was established on August 15, 1948, but the U.S. retained operational control of the military and the national police, which was a paramilitary, a very effective organization, well organized, lots of transport and so on, weapons, until our combat troops left at the end of June 1949. So for almost a year, the U.S. had operational control. And then when you look at the daily sit reps and documents that you have in the archives, it's just clear that the U.S. was directing this suppression. And it's shameful to me that there was so little concern with the loss of human life. 10% of the occupation of the island population was murdered. Tens of thousands more went to Osaka. And this all happened on the American watch, and nothing was done about it. So I just wanted to make those comments because I think this is an American problem. Along with the Korean problem, it's an American problem. If you heard of some occupation like the ones we used to do in Central America, where 10% of the Guatemalan or Haitian people were killed, and a bunch of fascists took over with U.S. help, you would be very upset about it. But somehow this particular rebellion, maybe because of the image of North Korea being so terrible in this country, just sort of falls between the stools and people don't pay attention to it. But we're paying attention to it today.
Okay, thank you. Univ question.
So many of you look forward to Professor Cummings' keynote address. So today, so my comments should be brief, and I'd like to to make some comments on each speakers from legal perspective. I'm a reparations scholar from Hokkaido University. Well, regarding Professor Hope May, I think her presentation very theoretically interesting. And many of the audience, many people in the audience still might be wondering why she put emphasis on the time 30 years before Jeju massacre. But it seems she's talking about that historical background that coincided with Bishop Khan's keynote address, because basic principle or basic human values, for example, democracy or the self-determination was arising in those days, and thinking about the reparations, I think the core basic human rights, core values is very important, because I'm working on reparations with regard to many cases in East Asia, and I'm also working on Ainu people, that's the indigenous people in Hokkaido where I'm from. They're talking of the right of self-determination. That's the core value of the 2007 UN Declaration of Indigenous People's Rights, but still missing with regard to Ainu people. So in that sense, her talk is very theoretical, and she's talking from the ethical concern, and I understand she's an expert of international law and international human rights law. And she mentioned the 4R of Professor Eric Yamamoto, and it's stated in the book. You might get at hand page 229. That's recognition, and responsibility, reconstruction, and reparation. And he stated for his theory about 4R 2 decades ago in his great trailblazing article named Interracial Justice at the turn of the century already. And he mentioned the importance of recognition of past injustice at the first stage. And to know the past injustice, as Professor Hope May mentioned, we have to know the human rights core guiding principles. That's what I understand. I myself didn't have any chance to read the presenters' papers in advance. This is a kind of instantaneous comment. And regarding Professor Huang, her investigation is sociological, and as many of you know, may gather, the Confucianism is masculine doctrine, and the research from the gender perspective, women's feminist perspective is missing. So in that sense, her monograph is very valuable. And on the other hand, I myself be interested in the origins of women's powers of resistance in Jeju Island. And regarding Professor Ho's presentation and his assertion about the U.S. responsibility, as Professor Cummings pointed out, it's empirical and is down-to-earth research and very reasonable. And so I'm very sorry about the time limitation. That's it.
Okay, thank you everybody. And hopefully I am so impressed visual Kang and define Jeju Sasang was a beautiful flower. Plus, in history stream, I just concluded these sessions, due definition, due conclusion. And among the United States responsibility, United States American problems, and so widow survivors, and so I am so happy to conclude this session. And thank you for every speakers and discussants. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm going to make some announcements about lunch. Okay, so we will conclude, we will have lunch until 1:40. So session 2 is going to be starting at 1:40. And we have, for the audience, or people, we have food out in the back. And also for participants, I will show you where we have another room for us if you want to sit down and